The negotiation request was genuine. That was the thing that made what followed so difficult to categorize afterward, when the parties who had been present were trying to describe what had happened to the parties who had not. The request had not been a trap, had not been a delay tactic, had not been any of the things that negotiation requests sometimes were when the party requesting them was using the request as cover for something else. It had been a genuine request from the Tharjavian Confederacy's new leadership to Earth's Foreign Affairs Division for a formal bilateral session to address the outstanding disputes that had accumulated across 8 years of deteriorating relations between the two civilizations. 8 years, 3 incidents with the Directorate, 2 formal complaints, 1 near escalation that the Conclave's Mediation Division had stepped into at the last possible moment. The outstanding disputes were documented and real, and the new leadership's request to address them was, by every measure that Earth's diplomatic division applied to incoming requests, sincere. Ambassador Reyes received the request on a Monday. She read it twice. She filed it in the category she kept for things that were what they said they were, and that deserved to be treated as such. She also flagged it to the office that was not in the publicly available directory, the one that answered without names, and noted in the flag that the request was genuine and the timing was significant. The timing was significant because of what Earth's intelligence division had been watching for the preceding 11 months, not the Tharjavian Confederacy specifically, the pattern that the Confederacy was part of. The specific configuration of relationships and capabilities and positioning that 11 months of analysis had assembled into a picture that Earth's Strategic Assessment Division had classified under a designation, that the designation system, reserved for situations that required immediate attention at the most senior level. The picture said, the Tharjavian Confederacy's new leadership is genuine about negotiation. The Tharjavian Directorate, which operates with significant autonomous authority and which has not been reformed by the new leadership in any structural sense, is not. The picture also said, the Directorate has been in communication with 3 external parties whose interests are aligned against Earth's regional presence. The communication has been producing coordination. The coordination has a timeline. The timeline was the most significant element of the picture. It said the coordination would mature in approximately 6 to 10 weeks. The negotiation request had been filed 8 weeks before Earth's Strategic Assessment Division put the final timestamp on the timeline. Reyes held the flag for 2 days. She was holding 2 things simultaneously. The genuine request from leadership that deserved a genuine response, and the picture that said the context surrounding the genuine request was not what it appeared. On the 3rd day, she called Director Solano. Solano was retired from the Foreign Affairs Division, but Reyes called her because Solano had built the framework that Earth's diplomatic approach operated within, and because some calls went to the people who had built the thing. She said, I have a genuine request in a complicated context. Solano said, describe the complication. She described it. Solano was quiet for a moment. She said, the leadership is genuine. Reyes said, yes. Solano said, and the Directorate is not. Reyes said, not about the negotiation, about what the negotiation creates conditions for. Solano said, the negotiation creates a window. Reyes said, the coordination has a timeline. The negotiation request arrived 8 weeks before the timeline matures. The negotiation process, if we engage with it honestly, will take weeks. Solano said, weeks that overlap the timeline. Reyes said, yes. Solano said, and if we decline the request? Reyes said, we decline a genuine request from leadership that is trying to repair 8 years of deteriorating relations. We validate the Directorate's position that Earth is not interested in diplomatic resolution. We hand the directorate the framing they need for whatever the coordination produces. Solano said, and if we accept? Reyes said, we engage in a genuine negotiation in a window that the directorate is using for something else. We are present at a table while the thing under the table is being assembled. Solano said, you cannot tell the leadership about the directorate's coordination. Reyes said, not without compromising the sources that produce the picture, and not without the possibility that the leadership's channels are not as separate from the directorates as the leadership believes they are. Solano was quiet for a long time. Then she said, what does Earth need to do in the window? Reyes said, close it. Solano said, close the window before the coordination matures. Reyes said, the window is the timeline. The timeline is 6 to 10 weeks. The coordination requires the window to complete. Solano said, and what closes it? Reyes said, the thing that changes the directorate's calculation about whether completing the coordination is worth the cost. Solano said, which is? Reyes said, being present in the calculation in a way that changes it. Solano said, one ship. Reyes said, not this time. Solano said, what this time? Reyes said, the directorate has been running operations against Earth for 8 years, 3 incidents. The new leadership is genuine about reform. The directorate has not reformed. The directorate is coordinating with external parties. The coordination has a timeline. The window is real. She paused. She said, this time what closes the window is what we should have sent to change the directorate's calculation 8 years ago before the 3 incidents and the 2 formal complaints and the near escalation. Solano said, you have been building toward this. Reyes said, we have been building toward every situation that required it. This one requires it. Solano said, you accept the negotiation request. Reyes said, I accept the negotiation request, genuinely, because the request is genuine and because leadership deserves a genuine response and because the negotiation is not the problem. Solano said, and while the negotiation is happening. Reyes said, while the negotiation is happening, the window closes. Solano said, in a way the directorate can see. Reyes said, in a way the directorate cannot miss. Solano was quiet for a moment. She said, and the leadership? Reyes said, the leadership will be sitting at a table with Earth when the window closes. They will see it close. They will understand what was happening underneath the negotiation they requested, and then they will have a choice about what to do with that understanding. Solano said, you are betting that genuine leadership, confronted with evidence of what the directorate was doing, chooses the negotiation over the directorate. Reyes said, I am betting that genuine leadership that requested genuine negotiation and received genuine engagement has a basis for making that choice that it did not have before. Solano said, and if the bet is wrong? Reyes said, then we close the window anyway and find out what comes next from a position that is different from the position we were in before. Solano was quiet. Then she said, accept the request, send what needs to be sent. Reyes said, yes. She accepted the request. She sent the notification to the office that answered without names. The notification said, the negotiation is accepted, timeline confirmed. What needs to be sent should be positioned to be visible at the appropriate moment, not before, not after. The office that answered without names sent back 2 words. Understood, ready. The negotiation session was scheduled for 4 weeks from the acceptance. The session would take place on neutral ground, the standard diplomatic venue that the Conclave's mediation division maintained for bilateral sessions of this sensitivity. The Tharjavian Confederacy's senior diplomatic representative would attend. Reyes would attend for Earth. The 4 weeks were used. Not by Reyes. She spent the 4 weeks on the preparation that genuine negotiation required, which was the reading of 8 years of documented disputes and the assembly of positions that addressed each dispute honestly, and the development of frameworks that could produce resolutions that the genuine leadership could take back to their constituency and present as genuine progress. The preparation was real. The frameworks were real. The position Earth would take at the table was the position that 8 years of disputes warranted, and not a performance of position. The 4 weeks were also used by the office that answered without names. On the morning of the session, at 600, 4 hours before the session was scheduled to begin, something appeared at the edge of the Tharjavian system. Not quietly, not with the specific invisibility that Earth's dark matter composite vessels moved through space with when they chose to be invisible. Openly, with full transponder broadcast, full identification, all frequencies broadcasting the vessel's designation and registry, and the specific information that any party monitoring the Tharjavian system's approach corridors would need to know exactly what had arrived. The Tharjavian system's approach corridor monitoring received the transponder broadcast at 6:01. The duty officer at the Confederacy's monitoring station processed the broadcast at 6:02. At 6:03, the duty officer transmitted an urgent notification to the Confederacy Security Command. At 6:07, the Security Command transmitted an urgent notification to the Directorate. At 6:09, the Directorate transmitted an urgent notification to the 3 external parties, whose coordination was 7 weeks into a 6 to 10 week timeline. The vessel that had appeared at the edge of the Tharjavian system was called the UEN Absolute Threshold. The Threshold was not a vessel class that appeared in any database that the Tharjavian Directorate's Intelligence Division maintained on Earth's military assets. It was not a vessel class that appeared in the Conclave's shared vessel registry, which the Directorate's analysts accessed through channels that were not supposed to be accessible to the Directorate, and that the Directorate had been accessing through those channels for 6 years. It was not in any registry, because the threshold had never been disclosed. The threshold was what 40 years of Earth's most advanced engineering produced when the engineering was not constrained by the disclosure timeline, when the question being asked was not what are we ready to show, but what are we capable of building, when the program was the one that existed in the space between what Earth showed and what Earth was. The threshold was large in the way that made large an inadequate word. Not large in the scale of the ancient fleet's vessels, which were large in the way of things that had been built by a different civilization across a different technological history. Large in the way of something that had been built by Earth, with Earth's specific combination of 40 years of material science and dark matter, composite engineering and observer fabric physics, and the instant relocation drive, and everything that Tuesday had produced across 40 years of the work, combined into a single vessel that was the answer to the question of what happened when all of it was put in one place. The Tharjavian Directorate's Intelligence Division spent 40 minutes attempting to analyze the threshold sensor profile. At the end of 40 minutes, the analysis produced a classification that the division's senior analyst transmitted to the Directorate's senior leadership, with a notation that she had not used in 14 years of running threat assessments. The notation said, "Classification not achievable with available analytical framework. Recommend immediate framework revision." The Directorate's senior leadership received the classification at 6:49. At 6:52, the Directorate's senior leadership transmitted a communication to the 3 external parties, whose coordination was 7 weeks into the timeline. The communication was brief. It said, "Situation has changed. Stand by." At 700, the threshold opened a communication channel to the Tharjavian system's monitoring station. The voice that came through the channel belonged to Captain Priya Adami, who had been commanding Earth's most advanced vessel for the 11 months that the threshold had been at operational strength, who had been told, when she was given the command that the command was the preparation for the moment that required it, and that she would know the moment when it arrived, and that knowing it was part of the command. She said, "This is Captain Priya Adami of the United Earth Navy vessel Absolute Threshold. We are conducting a standard transit of this approach corridor. We are broadcasting full identification and are available for any queries from system authority. Have a good morning." The monitoring station did not respond for 37 seconds. Then it said, "UEN Absolute Threshold. You are cleared for transit. Your registry is not in our database." She said, "The registry filing is being submitted today. We apologize for any inconvenience." The monitoring station said, "What class is the Absolute Threshold?" She said she is a new class. We are calling it the Threshold class. She is the first of it. The monitoring station said, "The first?" She said, "Yes." The monitoring station said, "Are there others planned?" She said, "The program is ongoing." She closed the channel. At 7:12, the three external parties transmitted a communication to the Tharjavian Directorate. The communication said, "We need more information before the timeline can continue." At 7:14, the Tharjavian Directorate transmitted back. The communication said, "We will get back to you." At 900, the bilateral session began. Reyes arrived at the neutral venue with her delegation. The Tharjavian Confederacy's senior diplomatic representative, an official named Thas who had been selected by the new leadership specifically for his reputation for genuine engagement, arrived with his delegation. They sat at the table. The session began with the standard diplomatic opening, the exchange of formal statements, the establishment of the agenda, the confirmation that both parties were present with the authority to negotiate rather than to merely discuss. The Tharjavian diplomatic representative had the quality of someone who was present at a table, and was also processing something that was not the table, and was trying to maintain the presence at the table while the other thing was processed. Reyes had expected this. She said at the end of the opening statements, "Representative Thas, I want to address something before we begin the substantive agenda." He said, "Yes, Ambassador." She said, "Your monitoring station will have received a notification this morning about a vessel in the approach corridor." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to be direct with you about what that vessel is and why it is there." He said, "Please." She said, "The Absolute Threshold is the most capable vessel Earth has built. It arrived in your approach corridor this morning because Earth's intelligence assessment identified a situation in your system that required Earth's presence to be visible in a specific way, not as a threat, as a fact. As a statement of what Earth is and what Earth is capable of, that we believe the parties who are conducting coordination against Earth's regional interests within your system needed to understand before that coordination matured." Thas looked at her. He said, "Coordination against Earth's interests within our system." Reyes said, "The Tharjavian Directorate has been in communication with three external parties for 11 months. The communication has been producing coordination that has a timeline. The timeline was 6 to 10 weeks from your leadership's negotiation request. The negotiation request was genuine. The context surrounding it was not entirely what it appeared." Thas was very still. He said, "You accepted the negotiation request knowing this?" She said, "I accepted the negotiation request because it was genuine, and because the leadership that made it deserved a genuine response, and because the table is always the thing we prefer." He said, "And the vessel?" She said, "The vessel is what closes the window that the Directorate's coordination required, not by force, by presence, by the specific kind of presence that changes a calculation without requiring the calculation to be forced." He said, "You are telling me that while I am sitting at this table, Earth is addressing the Directorate's coordination through the presence of that vessel in our approach corridor. She said, I am telling you everything I know about the situation you are in so that you can make the choice this situation requires with full information. He said, what choice? She said, whether the coordination that the Directorate has been building continues in a context where the threshold is a fact the coordination has to account for, or whether the new leadership that made a genuine request for genuine negotiation uses this moment to address the structural problem that has produced 8 years of incidents. He said, the structural problem being the Directorate's autonomous operational authority. She said, yes. He said, you are asking me to reform the Directorate. She said, I am offering you the table and the information. What you do with both is your decision. I am not here to make it for you. He looked at her. He said, the vessel in our approach corridor. She said, is conducting a standard transit. It will be visible for as long as the transit takes. He said, and if I ask it to leave? She said, it will leave. We are guests in this corridor and we behave like guests. He said, and if I do not ask it to leave? She said, then it completes its transit and the Directorate's calculation has the threshold in it permanently. Because the registry filing is going in today and the program is ongoing and the first of a class is the beginning, not the end. He held that. He said, 8 years of incidents. She said, yes. He said, the near escalation. She said, yes. He said, and Earth did not respond then. She said, Earth responded at the level the situation required each time. This situation requires a different level. He said, because of the coordination. She said, because the coordination is the Directorate making a calculation that Earth's presence in this region is manageable at a cost the Directorate is willing to pay. We are correcting the calculation. He said, by showing us the threshold. She said, by being the threshold. By being what Earth is, at the level this moment requires, in a way that is visible to everyone who needs to see it. He was quiet for a long time. The table between them held the 8 years of documented disputes that the session had been convened to address. The disputes were real, and the frameworks Reyes had prepared to address them were real, and the genuine request that had produced this session was real. All of it was real. And underneath all of it, in the Tharjavian system's monitoring stations, and in the Directorate's communications with 3 external parties, and in the moment that the threshold had appeared at the edge of the approach corridor at 600 and broadcast its full identification on all frequencies, something else was also real. Something that Thas was sitting with at the table, and that Reyes was waiting for him to resolve. He said, Ambassador Reyes. She said, Representative Thas. He said, I would like to take a 30-minute recess. She said, of course. He left the table. He spent 22 of the 30 minutes on his communication system. Reyes spent those 22 minutes reviewing her notes on the substantive agenda, because the session was going to continue, and the substantive agenda was going to be addressed, and the preparation was going to be used, because this was always how it worked. The thing that happened alongside the table and the table itself were always both real and both mattered and both required the work. Thas came back at 23 minutes. He sat down. He said, the Directorate's senior leadership has been informed that the new government is initiating a structural review of the Directorate's operational authority. The review will be conducted by an independent body. The timeline is immediate. Reyes said, that is a significant step. He said, it is a step that should have been taken 8 years ago. The incidents were not accidents. I know that. The leadership that requested this session knows that. We have been avoiding the structural problem because the structural problem is large, and the Directorate is old, and reforming old things with large authority is difficult. He said, the threshold is also large. He said, Sometimes the reason to do the difficult thing is that the alternative is larger than the difficult thing. Reyes said yes. He said, "Shall we address the substantive agenda?" She said yes. The session lasted 9 hours. At the end of 9 hours, the frameworks that Reyes had prepared had been applied to 6 of the 8 outstanding disputes and had produced agreements on 4 of them. The remaining 2 were complex enough to require a follow-up session that was scheduled before the current session ended. The threshold completed its transit of the Tharjavian approach corridor at 1347. As it left the system, it opened one final channel to the monitoring station. Captain Adami said, "Transit complete. Thank you for your cooperation. We will be filing the registry documentation today as stated. Safe operations to your system." The monitoring station said, "Safe transit, absolute threshold." She closed the channel. The threshold moved into the space beyond the Tharjavian system on its next heading, which was the heading that the program had determined was the correct next position, which was not back to Earth's territory, and was not to Conclave Station Primara, and was not to any of the locations that the Directorate's Intelligence Division would have predicted. It was to a position that made the program's ongoing nature visible to anyone who was watching the headings and drawing the conclusions that the headings supported. The 3 external parties received the Directorate's final communication on the coordination at 1600. The communication said, "We will not be continuing the coordination at this time." The 3 external parties received this and processed it, and each sent back their own version of the same response, which was some variation of understood and which communicated, in the gaps between understood and the next communication, the recalculation that had been required. In the neutral venue's conference room, Reyes gathered her notes from the 9-hour session and looked at the frameworks that had produced 4 agreements and 2 follow-up commitments, and thought about the table and what the table had accomplished. She thought it was a good day's work. She thought about Thas's 22 minutes and what they had produced. She thought about the threshold on its next heading. She thought about the program being ongoing and the first of a class being the beginning, and what that meant for every future situation that required what this one had required. She thought about how you knew when a situation required the threshold rather than one ship, when the situation required showing what Earth was at the level that changed the permanent calculation rather than the immediate one, when the moment called for the thing that could not be unseen rather than the thing that addressed the specific incident. She thought the answer was in the picture, in the 11 months of analysis and the 6 to 10 week timeline and the specific configuration of what was underneath the genuine request. The picture told you what the moment required. The picture was what the work produced. The work was what Tuesday was for. She left the conference room. She walked through the neutral venue's corridors toward the transit that would take her back to Conclave Station Primara. She thought about the substantive agenda and the 4 agreements and the follow-up session. She thought about Thas's 22 minutes and the structural review that had been initiated at the 23rd minute. She thought about the threshold on its heading. She thought that the most important thing that had happened today was not the threshold appearing at the approach corridor at 600, or the Directorate's coordination being interrupted, or the 4 agreements from 9 hours at a table. The most important thing was the 22 minutes. The 22 minutes were what happened when a genuine leadership at a genuine table was given the full information and the time to respond to it, and responded by doing the thing that had been difficult for 8 years. The threshold made the 22 minutes possible. But the 22 minutes were what mattered. They were always what mattered. The table was always what mattered. The rest was why the table worked.